The air left my lungs like I'd been punched, and for one strange second all I could register was the hard chill of the marble floor under my heels and the sharp scent of white roses warming beneath the ballroom lights. My father stood at the center of the reception room with a cream envelope pinched between two fingers, holding it away from his tuxedo as if it were contaminated. Behind him, the wall of glass reflected 100 stunned faces and the soft gold wash from the chandeliers overhead. My sister Juliana froze beside the wedding cake with one hand still curved around her champagne coupe, her diamond bracelet sliding down her wrist. Preston Vale, her new husband, had gone rigid at her side, jaw tight, one palm pressed flat against the polished walnut of the sweetheart table. My stepmother, Diane Mercer, moved first, setting her hand on my father's forearm as if to steady him for something noble. Family attorney Gerald Sloan remained half a step behind them, shoulders square, briefcase at his ankle, not looking at me at all. Then my father lifted the envelope higher so the nearest guests could see my name written across the front. "You really thought you could do this tonight?" he said, his voice carrying cleanly over the last dying notes of a string quartet. "At your sister's wedding." Every conversation in the Bellwether Conservatory stopped. Even the waitstaff paused, silver trays held at chest height under the ember light. Somewhere near the dance floor, a fork hit a china plate with a small, bright sound. "My name is Celia Mercer. I'm 34, and this is the story of how I let my father disown me in public so I could dismantle everything he built in private. I had known for 3 weeks that he was planning to make a spectacle of me. I just hadn't expected him to do it before they cut the cake." He took one step forward and shoved the envelope into my hand. The paper was expensive, heavy, embossed with Mercer Family Office at the top in the same discreet navy font my father used for donation pledges and board invitations. The gesture looked almost ceremonial. If you hadn't known him, you might have mistaken it for dignity. "It's a formal notice," he said. "You are removed from the family trust, from the company, and from any further association with this family." Juliana gave a soft little gasp that would have sounded convincing to anyone who hadn't heard her rehearse sympathy in mirrors since she was 16. She turned to the guests with her fingers pressed against the neckline of her ivory silk gown. "Dad," she whispered, just loud enough to travel. "Maybe not here." "No," Preston snapped too quickly. "Actually, here is exactly where this belongs." That got everyone's attention back on me. Preston stepped forward, cufflinks flashing under the chandelier light. He was the sort of man who had learned confidence by watching other wealthy men perform it. Even now, with sweat beginning to gather at his temples, he kept one thumb hooked in his pocket and lifted his chin as if he were speaking at a board meeting instead of standing in front of 300 wedding guests. "Celia accessed restricted company files," he said. "She stole internal financials and tried to leverage them for money. When security searched her laptop bag, they found copies." A murmur moved through the room. Diane lowered her eyes and shook her head once, slowly, wearing the expression she saved for charity galas and funerals. Gerald Sloan finally looked up, but only to inspect the far wall as though the architecture interested him more than the accusation unfolding a few feet away. Juliana set her glass down with deliberate care. Her shoulders curled inward. A wounded bride, a dutiful daughter. The picture was immaculate. "You couldn't let one day be about anyone else," she said, voice trembling in exactly the right places. There it was. Not theft, not fraud, not the possibility of a federal investigation buried inside those files. Attention. That was the role they had assigned me. Bitter eldest daughter, difficult daughter, jealous daughter. My father had always understood something simple about public humiliation. If you make the lie emotional enough, people stop examining the facts. Around us, guests began turning their bodies toward the scene. I recognized board members from Mercer Urban Holdings, old church friends, the deputy mayor and his wife, Juliana's college sorority sisters in pale blue satin, 2 local reporters who had been invited because Preston liked seeing his own name in society pages. My cousin Amanda had already raised her phone chest high, recording openly. Her husband, Daniel, put a hand on her elbow, but he didn't tell her to stop. My father watched me carefully. He knew me well enough to expect anger. He wanted tears even more. Tears would make the rest easy. "I covered for you for years," he said, voice turning stern and paternal. "Your instability, your resentment, your poor judgment, but trying to sabotage your sister's wedding to extort this family ends tonight. The words landed hard because they were designed to. Instability, resentment, poor judgment. Those were not legal accusations. They were social ones, family ones, the kind that stick. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. My fingertips were steady point. 3 months earlier, I had been chief financial officer of Mercer Urban Holdings, the real estate development firm my father liked to call his legacy. 2 months earlier, I had discovered that legacy ran on a foundation of falsified environmental remediation invoices, pass-through shell companies, campaign slush funds, and a private ledger tracking payments so carefully concealed that they only became visible when one of the offshore accounts glitched and duplicated a routing trail. 6 weeks earlier, I had copied everything. 5 weeks earlier, I had hired my own counsel. Please subscribe my channel. FNACs. 4 weeks earlier, I had learned that my father intended to blame the whole structure on me. 3 weeks earlier, I had stopped trying to save him. Now he smiled very slightly, the way he did after signing a hostile contract. Say something, Preston demanded. I lifted my eyes to him. Are you sure? He frowned. Am I sure about what? That this is a version of events you want in front of witnesses, I said calmly. The silence that followed was absolute. Juliana let out a short laugh, brittle around the edges. Oh my God, you're still doing this. Celia, Diane said, taking one soft step toward me, palms outward. Please don't create more of a scene. More of a scene. I almost admire that. My father crossed his arms. If you have some excuse, make it brief. A server appeared at my shoulder, trapped by the halt in the evening, carrying a tray of untouched champagne coupes. I took one, not because I wanted it, but because the motion made everyone wait. The crystal was cold against my fingers. I held it without drinking. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized Disownment letter, a termination notice, and a one-page statement claiming I had been suspended 2 days earlier for unauthorized access to company systems. There was even a line indicating that certain, erratic personal behaviors had been documented by family members over time. It was thorough, legally dressed, cruel in a very organized way. I read all 3 pages in silence, while my sister shifted her weight and Preston exhaled through his nose, and Gerald Sloane adjusted the knot of his tie. My father hated silence he didn't control. Well, he said, now you understand. I folded the pages neatly and slid them back into the envelope. Then I smiled. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for anyone to believe me. I simply set my champagne glass down on the nearest table, reached into my clutch, and took out my phone. Thank you, I said. My father blinked. For what? For confirming the timeline. Something changed in the room, so subtly that only people who live on shifts in power ever recognize it. It wasn't fear yet. It was disruption. A single misstep in a dance everyone thought they had rehearsed. Juliana's fingers tightened around the edge of the cake table. Preston glanced at Gerald, and Gerald did not glance back. My father gave a small, dismissive laugh. You think a tone like that is going to save you? No, I said evenly. Documentation will. I unlocked my phone and brought up the first file. Preston moved toward me. Give me that. My gaze stayed on the screen. I wouldn't. His pace slowed, not because he respected me, because certainty had just become expensive. What exactly do you think you're doing? My father asked. The same thing you are, I said. Using tonight. Diane's hand fell from his sleeve. I turned the screen outward, not to the crowd yet, but to the 4 of them. The file displayed the metadata for the Disownment letter I had just been handed. Creation time, 2:14 p.m. Last edit, 2:27 p.m. Printer log. Mercer Family Office, Executive Suite, 3rd floor. The note at the bottom identified the user profile that had generated the print command. Gerald Sloane. I looked at him. Interesting that my removal from the family was drafted and printed 4 hours before Preston claims anyone found files in my bag. Gerald went pale, so quickly it looked as if someone had taken color from the room and left him out of it. Metadata can be altered. Of course, I said. That's why I also pulled the building access logs. I swiped. Second file. Timestamped entries from the family office. Gerald's badge had entered the executive suite at 2:08. My father's at 2:09. Diane's at 2:11. Juliana's at 2:19. Preston's at 2:22. Juliana stared at the screen. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Would you like me to keep going? I asked. Preston recovered first. He jabbed a finger toward me. You hacked office security. I exported records from the system I installed, I replied. That was true. 2 years earlier, after a ransomware scare, I had overseen the firm's internal security upgrade. My father loved taking credit for efficiency improvements he didn't understand. He never noticed when those systems preserved more than he intended. I swiped again. Third file. A still image from the catering corridor outside the bridal suite, pulled from a camera they had forgotten existed because it was mounted behind a floral arch and fed into a secondary storage server no one but me checked. The image showed Preston, head lowered, slipping a silver flash drive into the outer pocket of my laptop bag while Juliana stood watch in the hallway. Juliana made a sound then. Very small. Very human. That's not, she started. I moved to the next image. Same corridor. Same minute. My father entering from the service elevator, smoothing his tie, Gerald beside him with a folded document case under one arm. Guess we're closer now. Not crowding exactly, but leaning in. Curiosity has its own posture. Diane lifted her chin. This is private family business. No, I said quietly. It stopped being private when you turned it into evidence. My father's mouth flattened. He had realized, finally, that I had not come here to defend myself. I had come here to control sequence. He took one step nearer, lowering his voice. If you think embarrassing us in public will fix what you've done, I haven't gotten to what you've done. Those 7 words hit harder than anything else I had said. I let them settle. Then I opened the audio file. The room filled with static for half a second, followed by Preston's voice, unmistakable and impatient. Make sure it stays in her bag until security finds it. If we do this after the vows, nobody questions motive. She's always been the difficult one. A second male voice answered, softer. Leonard Pike, my father's chief operating officer and oldest friend. And if she pushes back? My father's recorded response came next. She won't. Not effectively. She's emotional when cornered. The clip ended. No one in the ballroom moved. The silence spread across the room like spilled ink. Juliana's eyes went to her father, then to Preston, then back to me, calculating at the speed of panic. Preston lifted both hands, as if that could physically push the accusation away from himself. That recording is illegal. That's your first concern, I asked. His mouth opened, closed. My father spoke through his teeth. What do you want? There it was at last. Not indignation. Not righteousness. Negotiation. I picked up a water glass from the table beside me and took a slow sip. The stemware left a faint ring of condensation on the linen. Across from me, Preston was breathing too fast. Juliana's shoulders had lost their careful bridal set. Diane had one hand at her throat, thumb rubbing the edge of her necklace. Gerald had finally bent to pick up his briefcase, not to leave, but because fear makes people reach for objects. What I want, I said, setting the glass down, is accuracy. Then I turned, just enough for the nearest cluster of guests to see the screen. I did not hold it overhead. I didn't need to. The point wasn't spectacle anymore. The point was that they all understood one thing at once. This was no longer a family scene. It was evidence in evening wear. I kept going. I showed the internal email from Diane's personal assistant forwarding my seating assignment to security with the note. Put her by the east corridor, so there's less foot traffic when this happens. I showed a draft press statement saved on Preston's phone backup, already prepared for the next morning. Mercer daughter removed after emotional outburst at sister's wedding. I showed the accounting memo with my digital signature attached to a wire transfer I had never authorized. Only the signature had been pasted over the document without matching encryption markers. A mistake so basic it would have been insulting if it weren't criminal. Diane sat down without seeming to realize she was doing it. Juliana whispered, "Dad." He didn't look at her. Preston tried again, louder now. Even if any of this is real, it doesn't explain the files you stole. That was when I gave him the line I had saved. Actually, I said, you were committing fraud. The words cracked through the room, cleanly. My father laughed once. Too hard. Too sudden. You have no idea what you're talking about. I met his eyes. I know about Harlow Basin LLC. I know about the duplicate remediation invoices, billed through Seabridge Consulting. I know why the campaign donation ledger is stored off the corporate books. I know you moved $682,000 through the Mercer Educational Foundation in 12 days and labeled it community outreach. I know Leonard backdated contractor approvals in March. I know Gerald drafted 2 indemnity letters and held them unsigned in case you needed a scapegoat. I know this wedding was supposed to make that scapegoat me. No one interrupted. The string quartet had stopped pretending to tune. Preston's face changed first. Not to guilt, to comprehension. He had married into a machine and only just realized how much of it I had mapped. "You've been in our systems," he said. "I was your systems." Juliana shook her head, once, sharply, as if trying to wake herself out of the moment. "Why would you do this to me? Today of all days?" I looked at her for a long second. My sister's veil still fell in a smooth line over one shoulder. There were sugar pearls on the cake behind her and white orchids wired into her hair. If a stranger had walked in then, they might have thought she was the injured party. "Because you asked me to help with your seating chart while you helped Dad move money through shell vendors," I said. "Because you CC'd me on fake board minutes and assumed I'd sign. Because last Tuesday you told Preston I would break beautifully if they cornered me in public. And because you kept calling it family." Gerald finally found his voice. "This conversation needs to stop immediately." "It will," I said. "In a minute." I reached into my bag and placed a slim silver flash drive on the walnut table between us. Small, plain, almost delicate. "This is a mirror copy of everything," I said. "Company ledgers, email exports, calendar pulls, badge logs, recorded calls, contract drafts, tax attachments, text messages, the off-book vendor list, and the folder Leonard named golf receipts, even though none of you golf." Leonard, who had been standing near the bar pretending not to belong to any side, straightened, so abruptly he knocked his untouched whiskey against the counter. Amber liquid spilled over polished stone. My father stared at the drive. His voice dropped into that cold register he used when punishing employees behind closed doors. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." I slid the drive back toward myself. "No, you made yours when you assumed humiliation was still leverage." Then I looked toward the ballroom doors. The wedding coordinator had just appeared in the entryway, frozen with one headset hand pressed to her ear. Behind her, framed by frosted glass and the spill of corridor light, stood 3 people in dark suits and 1 uniformed officer. Not guests, not hotel staff. Their posture gave them away before the badges did. Special Agent Daniel Ruiz from IRS Criminal Investigations stepped in first, face composed, one hand near his belt. Beside him was FBI Special Agent Marisol Bennett, carrying a leather portfolio and scanning the room with the efficient stillness of someone who had already decided where every exit was. No one spoke. My father turned slowly toward them. I picked up my water glass again. "You may want to save the rest for them," I said. What happened next lasted maybe 90 seconds. It felt longer because fear stretches time in ugly ways. Agent Ruiz asked for Charles Mercer, Preston Vale, Leonard Pike, and Gerald Sloan by name. Agent Bennett asked hotel security to close the ballroom exits until they sorted witness lists and electronic devices. Diane took a half step backward and hit the edge of a chair. Juliana's hand flew to Preston's sleeve, but he pulled away without noticing. Gerald actually tried to smile and introduce himself, which would have been embarrassing if it weren't so revealing. Leonard began talking before anyone had asked him a question. Guests scattered into clusters. Some backed away. Some moved closer. My cousin Amanda lowered her phone only when Daniel, her husband, physically pressed it toward the tablecloth. The deputy, mayor, left through the side corridor with his wife without collecting their coats. A bridesmaid started crying quietly into both hands. My father stayed very still. That was always his first instinct when something collapsed. Stillness. Calculation. He believed motion was admission. Agent Bennett spoke to him in a voice that was courteous enough to frighten anyone who understood what courtesy can sound like under federal authority. She asked him not to use his phone. She asked everyone named to remain available for questioning. She informed them that warrants had been executed earlier that evening on Mercer Urban Holdings accounting server and on 2 residential offices. She did not raise her voice once. I watched the information move through my father's face in layers. Surprise first, then anger, then the realization that timing had outpaced him. He looked at me, really looked at me, not as a daughter, not even as an adversary, as the architect of the room he was standing in. I met his gaze without blinking. They thought they had destroyed me with a letter and a camera phone, but they had no idea I had spent weeks arranging a much more official guest list. The next 11 days were a blur of interviews, subpoenas, digital forensics, and the kind of phone calls that make rich people suddenly rediscover religion. The wedding never made the society pages. The Bellwether Conservatory staff had signed non-disclosure agreements before midnight. Preston's family tried to keep the story contained to an unexpected legal matter. Juliana posted one tightly cropped black and white photo from the ceremony and disabled comments. My father did not speak to me. His attorneys did. On the 12th day at 9 a.m, I walked into the conference suite at Klein and Ortega on Madison Avenue. The reception area smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and the conference room beyond it was all dark glass, brushed steel, and a table of gleaming walnut long enough to turn apologies into logistics. Low winter light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and fell across a row of leather chairs waiting along one wall like jurors. My attorney, Tessa Klein, stood near the screen at the far end of the room with a yellow legal pad tucked under one arm. She wore charcoal wool, hair pinned back, no jewelry beyond a watch with a black leather strap. Tessa did not perform authority. She had too much of it for that. I had hired her 6 weeks before the wedding after a former SEC litigator I trusted heard my outline and said only one thing. You need someone who enjoys precision more than blood. Tessa enjoyed both. She was simply disciplined about the order. Morning, she said as I took my seat. How many came? All of them, she replied. Which means they're scared. Through the glass wall I watched them arrive one by one. My father entered first with 2 attorneys from Bell and Rowe, both in navy suits, both carrying files thick enough to signal seriousness. He looked 10 years older than he had at the wedding. Not broken, diminished. The silver at his temples seemed harsher under the white light. He no longer walked like a man entering his own building. He walked like a man assessing terrain. Diane came next, wrapped in a cream coat over a muted brown dress, sunglasses still on although she had just come in from a covered garage. She removed them only after sitting down. Her eyes were swollen, not from grief, I thought, but from the exhaustion of maintaining competing stories for too many different audiences. Juliana arrived with separate counsel and without her engagement glow. The tan she had cultivated for the wedding was fading in uneven patches along her hairline. Her posture was still elegant, but it required effort now. Preston came 5 minutes later, late enough to be tactical, with his own attorney and a new habit of glancing at every phone in the room as if one might suddenly speak. Leonard Pike shuffled in last, shoulders bent, tie crooked, carrying a messenger bag instead of a briefcase. He no longer looked like a chief operating officer. He looked like a man who had slept in his clothes. No one greeted me. That was fine. I hadn't come for civility. Tessa waited until everyone was seated. Then she clicked a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with the title of a document packet already sitting in front of each chair. Mercer Urban Holdings, Preliminary Evidentiary Timeline and Civil Exposure Summary. Gerald Sloan was not present. That absence mattered. Tessa rested her fingertips on the back of her chair. Let's begin with the simplest issue, she said. Miss Mercer was framed in advance of an anticipated regulatory and criminal inquiry. We can prove that. The rest of this meeting concerns whether you intend to make the government's case easier or merely uglier. One of my father's lawyers cleared his throat. We're here to discuss a possible resolution of internal family disputes. Tessa turned her head slightly. No, you're here because your clients are exposed on fraud, obstruction, tax conspiracy, wire fraud, falsified corporate filings, and retaliatory fabrication of evidence. The family portion is merely the most embarrassing. She clicked again. The first slide showed a calendar strip, clean and chronological. January 14th, environmental remediation contract awarded to Seabridge Consulting. January 17th, Seabridge payment routed to Harlow Basin LLC. January 19th, Harlow Basin transfers half to Mercer Educational Foundation. January 24th, Mercer Educational Foundation issues community outreach disbursements to 2 campaign committees and a political action consultant. March 3rd, Leonard Pike backdates contractor compliance certificates. April 28th, Charles Mercer forwards an internal audit concern to Gerald Sloan with the note, "If this breaks, Celia was in the chair." June 9th, Juliana Mercer circulates board minutes with altered vote language. August 2nd, Preston Vale drafts external communications response concerning rogue executive misconduct. October 11th, 2:14 p.m., Disownment letter created. October 11th, 8:43 p.m., evidence planted at wedding venue. October 11th, 9:02 p.m., federal agents enter Bellwether Conservatory. No flourish, just sequence. My father stared at the dates and refused to move. Tessa began walking them through each entry. Her method was almost soothing, which made it far more devastating than anger would have. She identified document numbers, email headers, payment authorizations, device IDs. She paired every date with an exhibit and every exhibit with a custodian. She treated the conspiracy as paperwork because in the end that is what most conspiracies become: binders, spreadsheets, voice memos, and people wishing they had deleted the right things. When she reached the Seabridge invoices, Leonard muttered, "Those were standard pass-throughs." Tessa looked up. "Standard for whom?" He swallowed, said nothing. She continued, "The duplicate remediation invoices, billed against 2 separate construction sites in Red Hook and Newark. The contractor certifications that used the same digital signature artifact 6 times because no one had bothered to vary the distortion field. The campaign consultant invoices submitted on weekends when the consulting office was demonstrably closed. The family foundation disbursements that matched private political commitments my father had made over dinner at the Ashford Club." Then she moved to motive. 2 months before the wedding, she said. An internal reconciliation anomaly indicated material exposure if regulators traced Harlow Basin. 3 days later, Mr. Mercer began circulating language positioning Miss Mercer as unstable and impulsive. 2 weeks after that, Mr. Vale created a media contingency statement blaming her for data theft. A week later, Mrs. Mercer reassigned ballroom seating to isolate Miss Mercer near a low-traffic corridor. This was not spontaneous family conflict. This was premeditation. Juliana's attorney leaned forward. "My client had no involvement in financial operations." Tessa nodded once. "Your client did, however, participate in staging evidence and coordinating the social setting for public discrediting." "That matters." Juliana turned to her father at last. "Tell them I didn't know what any of this actually was." My father didn't look at her. "Be quiet." There was a small fracture in the room then. Not loud, but real. Tessa let it widen. She clicked again. A new slide appeared. Message exports. Executive Assistant Device Archive. My father straightened. That was the first time all morning I saw genuine surprise. "Where did you get that?" one of his lawyers asked sharply. Tessa didn't answer him. She simply said, "I'd like to invite Ms. Lydia Chun in." The door opened. Lydia Chun stepped into the room wearing a navy sheath dress and a wool coat folded over one arm. She had worked as my father's executive assistant for 11 years. She managed his calendar, filtered his calls, coordinated donor dinners, corrected his grammar without bruising his ego, and knew where every file lived because he would have been helpless without her. My father trusted Lydia the way powerful men often trust competent women, completely, so long as they remain invisible. He rose halfway out of his chair. "Lydia!" She met his eyes for less than a second and took the seat beside Tessa. No one spoke. Tessa did it for them. Ms. Chun has supplied corroborating records from her retained device archive, including calendar screenshots, email forwards, and dictated notes concerning discussions of how to attribute potential liability to Miss Mercer. Diane stared at Lydia as though a piece of furniture had begun testifying. Juliana whispered, "You." Lydia folded her hands on the table. They were perfectly still. My father found his voice first. "You're violating privilege." Lydia replied before Tessa could. "You used my workstation to draft non-legal messaging about your daughter and labeled it privilege after the fact." She had always had a quiet voice. In that room it carried. Tessa nodded toward her. "Tell them why you came to us." Lydia took a slow breath. "On September 23rd, Mr. Mercer instructed me to prepare a chronology suggesting Celia had shown concerning volatility over the previous year. Several of the incidents he wanted included had not happened. When I asked what the document was for, Mrs. Mercer said it was protection. 2 days later, I was told that if outside review happened, the altered board minutes would be traced to my login credentials unless I remained cooperative. Leonard looked up sharply. That wasn't the plan. Lydia turned to him then, and I saw for the first time how much anger she had stored under that discipline. You told me in the parking garage that no one would believe me over the family. Leonard actually had the grace to look away. Tessa stepped back in. Miss Chin also retained audio memos from meetings where wedding timing was discussed. She placed transcripts on the table. Thin paper. Heavy consequences. Preston grabbed his first. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, faster. This is out of context. Tessa's expression did not change. Would you like to explain the context in which the statement, if she cries, we're done, but if she gets angry we own the room, becomes lawful? No one answered. My father finally turned to Lydia. After everything I did for you. That sentence told the whole story. Not innocence. Ownership. Lydia looked at him the way people look at old photographs, once they know what happened afterward. You paid me to organize your life, she said. You did not purchase my future. That landed so hard, even Tessa let the silence hold. Then the room split open completely. Juliana rounded on Preston first. You said this was just optics. You said it was about controlling a leak. Preston snapped back, because that's what your father said. Diane turned to Charles. You told me the company issue was temporary. My father slammed his palm once against the table. Enough! Leonard shoved his chair back a few inches. Don't do that. Not now. Not now. My father repeated, incredulous. This is when you're choosing a conscience. Leonard barked a laugh with no humor in it. No, Charles. This is when I'm choosing prison math. One of the attorneys interjected. Too late, asking everyone to stop speaking out of turn. Another asked for a 5-minute recess. Tessa denied it. She had them where she wanted them. Tired, exposed, and starting to see one another as liabilities instead of allies. I said nothing. That was deliberate, too. There is a specific power in becoming the only calm person at a collapsing table. Everyone begins orienting around your stillness, whether they want to or not. Tessa moved to the final section of her packet. Civilly, she said. Miss Mercer is prepared to pursue defamation, wrongful termination, fraudulent attribution of criminal conduct, trust interference, and intentional infliction of reputational harm. Criminally, those matters are no longer hers to control. However, her level of cooperation with certain civil limitations depends on how quickly the following steps occur. She slid a second set of papers into the center of the table. A resignation from my father's voting control of Mercer Urban Holdings. A stipulation acknowledging that the accusations made against me at the wedding were false and orchestrated. A release restoring my trust position and transferring to me my mother's original share allocation, which my father had quietly diluted after her death through board maneuvers he assumed I would never challenge. An agreement permitting an independent forensic receiver to review every Mercer entity, foundation, and affiliate account. A preservation order for all devices. And, separate from all that, a written statement of cooperation to federal investigators. My father's lawyer scanned the first page and went cold. This is surrender. Tessa gave him a polite look. No. Surrender happens after options disappear. This is triage. Juliana's attorney asked whether my sister truly needed separate exposure language if she signed early. Tessa said yes. Preston demanded to know whether his family firm's name would stay out of any public filing. Tessa said that depended on what federal subpoenas discovered. Diane asked whether civil resolution would protect the family home. Tessa said not if the family home had been renovated with mischaracterized company funds, which it had. My father sat back very slowly. When he spoke, he addressed me for the first time since the meeting began. How long, he asked, have you been planning this? I held his gaze. Since the day I realized you weren't trying to survive the audit. You were trying to feed me to it. A muscle moved in his jaw. You could have come to me. I almost laughed at that. Almost. I did, I said. 3 times. The first time, you told me not to confuse numbers with judgment. The second time, you said family protects itself. The third time you asked me how much loyalty my salary had bought. Diane closed her eyes. Juliana whispered, I didn't know you went to him. I turned to her. You never asked. That hurt her. I saw it. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true. My father leaned back and folded his hands in front of him, returning to the posture he used when trying to regain mastery by appearing above emotion. You think you've won because you found documents. No, I said quietly. I knew I had won when you needed a wedding to make me look guilty. He looked at me for a long second, and in that look was the whole old architecture of our family. His certainty, my usefulness, Juliana's protection, Diane's management, the expectation that love and obedience were the same thing if spoken in the right tone. It had taken me years to see how carefully that architecture had been built. It took one investigation to learn where the load-bearing beams were. I reached into my folder and slid one photo across the table. It was the still from the corridor again. Preston planting the drive, Juliana watching. My father's reflection visible in the catering door's narrow strip of steel. I wanted you to see them, I said. No one moved. Then I placed a printed email thread beside it. My father to Gerald. Gerald to Preston. Preston to Diane. Subject line, wedding evening contingency. I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find, I added. Preston stared at the page. What does that mean? I looked at him. The folder on my laptop wasn't the one you thought it was. His face changed. Tessa answered for me. Miss Mercer seeded a decoy directory containing enough irregular but non-criminal material to encourage an early accusation. It accelerated the conspiracy to frame her and preserved clean timing for investigators. The real evidence was never in her possession at the event. Leonard swore under his breath. My father turned to one of his attorneys. You knew about this. The man answered carefully. I knew there was significant exposure. I did not know your daughter had structured an evidentiary trap. I let that settle over the room. Then I looked at Lydia and said, next time, make sure your executive assistant isn't working for both sides. For the first time that morning, Lydia almost smiled. The attorneys called for caucus after that. Separate rooms. Separate calculations. For 3 hours we moved through the procedural choreography wealthy people use when they finally understand that money can no longer solve the moral dimension, only the scheduling. Juliana cried in a private office, though not loudly. Preston spent 40 minutes trying to reach someone at Vale Capital and failed. Diane asked twice whether I would meet with her alone. I declined both times. Leonard demanded indemnity from my father and was informed there would be none. Tessa took calls from federal counsel and came back with exactly the expression she always wore after confirming leverage, none. At 4:23 in the afternoon, we reconvened at the walnut table. The winter light had gone flatter, turning the city outside into steel and mirror. Coffee cups had multiplied, so had exhaustion. My father signed first. He did it with a black fountain pen he had carried for years, the same one he used for scholarship checks, land purchases, and holiday cards with personalized notes written by Lydia and signed by him. He read every page. He initialed every marked line. When he finished, he set the pen down parallel to the edge of the document with mechanical neatness. Diane signed next, then Juliana, hand trembling on the release language, then Leonard, who looked almost relieved to convert fear into ink. Preston resisted longest, objecting to wording, posturing about reputational damage, asking whether staged evidentiary circumstances could be softened. Tessa told him no. He signed. The room was quiet when it was over. Not healed, not peaceful, just finished. Tessa gathered the executed packets and passed copies to the respective attorneys. She gave final instructions on preservation, contact limitations, and next steps with the receiver. Then she sat back and let the silence belong to us. My father stood. The others followed more slowly. He buttoned his jacket, looked at me across the table, and said, I hope this was worth it. I rose too, smoothed the sleeve of my coat, picked up my bag. Then I gave him the only answer that felt honest enough. You always said the family name had to be protected, I said. You should have protected it from yourself. I left before anyone could answer. 6 months later, I was living downtown in a sunlit apartment on the 10th floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, where the windows were framed in black steel and the kitchen counters were pale quartz that stayed cool even in summer. Every morning, light moved across the wood floors in long bright bands, and I made coffee in a heavy ceramic dripper my friend Nora had given me after the mediation ended. On good days, I sat by the open window with my mug warming both hands and listened to the city assemble itself below me. Delivery trucks, distant horns, a dog barking somewhere on the block, the ordinary life I had once treated as background. Sunlight lay across the counter like folded silk. The first month after the signing was administrative. Receivers, auditors, restated filings, interviews with investigators. The second month was uglier. Local business press picked up the Mercer story after a sealed motion in one of the related cases leaked enough detail to make discretion impossible. The headline was dry. The consequences were not. My father resigned from 3 boards before he could be removed from 4 more. Mercer Urban Holdings lost 2 municipal bids and a private credit facility inside 10 days. His portrait came down from the lobby of the company headquarters after employees complained it made the place feel hostile. He was not led away in handcuffs. Real life is usually less theatrical than people hope. But he did spend most of his days moving between lawyers, forensic accountants, and federal proffer sessions, which in his world was almost worse. He had spent 30 years constructing authority through access. Now every room he entered belonged to someone else. Diane's consequences were social first and financial second. The charitable foundation luncheon circuit that had once treated her like polished royalty stopped calling. Invitations thinned. Committee positions quietly rotated. Women who had once kissed both her cheeks at gallery openings began greeting her from a distance. She sold 2 pieces of jewelry through a broker she thought no one knew she used. People always know. She moved through the city for a while with oversized sunglasses and the brittle smile of someone trying to hold elegance together after the scaffolding is gone. Juliana's reckoning was slower because beauty buys denial on installment. For the first few weeks, she posted carefully framed fragments of married life from the Vale townhouse in Greenwich. Neutral flowers, a breakfast tray, the sleeve of Preston's sweater. No faces. Then the post stopped. Preston's firm put him on leave pending internal review of undisclosed involvement with a client-connected fraud matter. Leave became resignation. Resignation became time away to focus on family. Family, in this case, lasted 4 months. Their marriage did not survive the year. The wedding album never arrived from the original photographer because the photographer refused final delivery until legal holds on certain raw files were resolved. That felt fitting somehow. The whole day remained incomplete. Preston, who had once spoken in that smooth certainty borrowed from richer men, became the kind of person who sends messages at 1:13 a.m. beginning with legal threats and ending with emotional debris. First he accused me of destroying his career. Then he tried nostalgia. Then outrage again. Once in November, he sent a 4-line text insisting we had both been manipulated by Charles and should talk adult to adult. I archived it without replying. 2 weeks later he sent, "You didn't have to go nuclear." I archived that too. Silence is underrated when the other person has spent years counting on your reaction. Leonard Pike cooperated fastest. He flipped as soon as the government made it clear loyalty would not reduce sentencing exposure. His wife left him in August. I learned that from Lydia over lunch, not from any official source. Leonard had built his whole adult identity around being indispensable to my father. It turned out he was merely adjacent. Gerald Sloan retired abruptly from practice, citing health reasons. That was the public version. The less public version involved bar complaints, privilege arguments, and a devastating number of emails in which he sounded less like counsel than a man trying to preserve a client by manufacturing a narrative around a daughter he had watched grow up. I had expected anger when I thought about Gerald. What I felt, mostly, was fatigue. Communication attempts arrived from all of them in waves. My father never texted. He left voicemails. Short at first. Controlled. Call me when your attorneys stop performing. Then colder. You are confusing procedure with principle. Then, after a certain set of hearings went badly for him, quieter. Celia, this doesn't need to become permanent. The last one came on a gray Tuesday in January. He said, "I don't recognize this family anymore." I listened once and saved it to an archive folder named Personal Records. Juliana sent messages late at night. Some were angry. Some were self-pity dressed as reconciliation. One simply said, "I miss you. The family isn't the same." I read it while standing in my kitchen with rain ticking against the glass and my dinner cooling on the stove. I felt something then, but not enough to answer. Missing the old arrangement was not the same as grieving what she had helped destroy. Diane wrote the longest messages, paragraphs about misunderstanding, pressure, her role as a wife, the impossible position she had been placed in. She never once used the word sorry without attaching it to circumstances that diluted it. I did not answer any of them. Instead, I built something. 3 months after the mediation, I opened Mercer Whitmore Advisory with a former colleague named Nora Whitmore, who had left a major accounting firm after deciding she preferred difficult truths to elegant spin. We worked out of a restored loft office with exposed brick, matte black shelving, and a conference table made from reclaimed oak. We specialized in governance cleanups for family-run businesses, internal retaliation investigations, compliance systems, and forensic preparation when someone inside a company had begun to suspect they were being set up for other people's decisions. It was not glamorous. It was useful. Our first clients were 2 sisters who owned a distribution company their uncle had been quietly draining for years. The second was a nonprofit controller who needed to document donor restrictions her board chair kept overriding. Then came a boutique construction firm, a regional health network, a widow whose late husband's partner had been treating handwritten side agreements as if they were law. Word traveled. It always does when you solve the problem people are too ashamed to describe clearly. I had not set out to become the person people called when power inside a family business turned predatory. Then again, many careers are just survival skills, given a business address. Lydia joined us part-time in the fall as operations director. Watching her build systems in our office was one of the quiet pleasures of that year. She labeled everything properly. She corrected our calendar logic. She replaced our ugly temporary mugs with ceramic ones that didn't wobble on the table. The first time a nervous client arrived 20 minutes early, and Lydia guided her into the conference room with tea, tissues, and no pity in her voice, I knew I had chosen well. One Thursday in late October, the 2 of us were eating lunch at a narrow little place on Hudson Street with bentwood chairs, white subway tile, and front windows thrown open to a warm afternoon. I was halfway through a salad I barely remembered ordering when Lydia set down her fork and said, very casually, "You won't believe who I just saw." I looked up. "If you say my father, I will ask for dessert." She almost smiled. "Preston, that doesn't surprise me." Outside the county records office. That got my attention. "Doing what?" She took a sip of iced tea, arguing with a clerk about document fees. I let that sit for a second. Preston had once referred to county clerks as invisible infrastructure. Now he was apparently losing to one. What was he filing? I asked. From the envelope in his hand, either lien paperwork or a sale transfer. He looked very expensive and very ignored. His name dropped into conversation like a stone in clear water. I laughed then, not because downfall is funny in itself, but because irony sometimes arrives with such precise timing that refusing to appreciate it feels wasteful. Lydia leaned back in her chair. He saw me, and he looked like he wanted me to feel bad for him. "Did you?" She considered that seriously. "No." Good answer. Not everything that survived the collapse was professional. Some things turned into friendship without asking permission first. Nora came over on Sundays with pastries and impossible gossip from the finance world she had cheerfully abandoned. Lydia and I developed an unspoken tradition of walking the river after late client meetings when the weather allowed it. Tessa remained Tessa, which meant she texted only in complete sentences, and once sent me a bottle of bourbon with a note that read, "For the day you stop flinching when your phone rings." Progress was measurable. The best karma updates rarely arrived from official channels anyway. They came through ordinary conversation. A former board member mentioning at a benefit that Charles Mercer now had to ask permission before selling property tied to the receivership. A banker quietly telling Nora that Diane's line of credit had been reduced. Lydia hearing from an old receptionist that Mercer Urban's employees had started calling the compliance hotline the Celia Clause, because for the first time in company history, they believed someone might actually listen if they reported retaliation. That last one stayed with me. Not because it vindicated me, because it meant the structure had changed in places I would never see. That evening in early spring, nearly a year after the wedding, I stood on my balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city loosen into dusk. The sunset poured over the rooftops like honey, turning the windows across the street into sheets of copper for a few quiet minutes before the color softened. Below me, traffic moved in patient ribbons. Above it all, the first lights came on across lower Manhattan. City lights bloomed below us like embers. Lydia was with me, leaning against the railing in a cream sweater, shoes kicked off near the door. We had finished a long week and an even longer dinner. She had brought a bottle of red from a vineyard upstate and a paper bag of almond cookies from the bakery on my corner. There was music playing softly from inside, something old and warm with piano under it. A year earlier, she would have been seated outside my father's office, screening my calls, defending his time, reinforcing a hierarchy neither of us fully understood until it turned on us. Now she was on my balcony, laughing at Nora's voice notes and asking whether the herb planters I bought were going to survive me. It was such an ordinary scene. That was the miracle. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. I took a sip of wine before answering. "Less than I used to." She nodded. "I think about the cake." I looked at her. "The wedding cake," she said. "All that planning. All that sugar work. And then federal agents." I laughed softly. "That is not where I expected your memory to land. It's efficient symbolism. That sounds like you spent too much time around lawyers." She lifted her glass in acknowledgement. Occupational hazard. We stood there for a moment without speaking. The air had cooled enough to raise a faint chill along my arms. Somewhere down the block, someone was washing dishes with their kitchen window open. I could hear plates touching. A train moved in the distance. Then Lydia said, "For what it's worth, I think they made you." I turned toward her. "That sounds generous." "It isn't," she said. "I mean they tried to reduce you to whatever would be easiest to control. And they failed. That's different." I looked out over the city again. She was right, though not in the way people usually mean when they talk about surviving betrayal. I had not become stronger because pain is noble. Pain isn't noble. It's just pain. What changed me was the necessity of seeing clearly. Once I saw the machinery for what it was, I couldn't unknow it. The daughter I had been for most of my life believed competence earned protection, believed restraint would be recognized as loyalty, believed if I kept the books balanced, answered carefully, and did not ask certain questions too loudly, there would always be a path back to belonging. The woman I became understood something harder and far more useful. Belonging that depends on silence is only another form of obedience. I set my glass on the railing and leaned both forearms against the cool metal. Below us the city kept moving, indifferent and alive. I thought about my old life in the Mercer house with its limestone foyer, its polished banisters, its dining room conversations where every compliment carried an invoice hidden inside it. I thought about the version of me who kept mistaking usefulness for love. I did not hate her. She had survived the only way she knew how. But I was glad she was gone. I never sent my father a thank you note. I never called my sister back. I never gave Diane the absolution she kept trying to mail to herself through me. But in the privacy of my own mind, on nights like that one when the air was clear and the city felt wide enough to hold both grief and relief, I did sometimes offer them a kind of gratitude. Not for what they did, for what it forced me to become. Because if they had been kinder, I might have stayed smaller. If they had been subtler, I might have doubted myself longer. If they had not tried so carefully to break me in public, I might never have discovered how calm I could remain while building the evidence that ended them. Lydia picked up her glass again and held it out toward me. "To fresh starts," she said. I touched mine lightly to hers. "To accurate records." She smiled into her wine. "That too." We drank, and the last line of sunlight slipped below the buildings, leaving the sky washed in amber and blue. For a long time after, I stayed on the balcony alone, watching office towers turn into constellations one floor at a time. The city had that evening hush it gets just before night fully claims it, when everything seems outlined in gentler light, and even your old injuries feel less like open wounds than places the weather once changed you. I thought about the girl who stood in a wedding reception with a Disownment letter in her hand and every eye in the room waiting for her to break. I thought about the woman standing here now, in an apartment she paid for herself, with work that meant something, friendships built on truth, and a life no one could threaten by withdrawing their approval. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's about building a life that no longer requires their permission. And as the last of the orange glow faded from the glass across the street, I realized that was the truest thing I had learned from any of it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about punishment at all. It's about becoming ungovernable by the people who once mistook your love for leverage.